Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. As always, Eyes on Israel is powered by Israel 365. Make sure to go to Israel365news.com for all your news and updated analysis from Israel, and go to Israel365.com to check out everything that we have to offer there, including my author page where you can find all of my writings. Israel 365 has a range of programs and a range of products, and it's a great way to support this show by getting involved and a great way to stay informed about what's really going on in Israel. This past Monday, May 27th, it was reported that dozens of Gazans were killed and hundreds injured in an Israeli airstrike in Rafah. If true, this incident would confirm the worst fears and warnings we've been hearing for months, namely, that an Israeli invasion of Rafah would mean terrible loss of civilian life. Everyone from President Biden and Secretary of State Tony Blinken to the UN and the Egyptian government have been freaking out, basically, pressuring Israel not to go into Rafah because of the high concentration of civilians there, most of whom had moved there from the northern part of the Gaza Strip in the early weeks of the war. The mainstream media was quick to jump on the story as evidence of Israel's wanton use of inappropriate force. This, of course, turned out to be false, as we'll soon see. Accepting the initial reports of Israeli culpability for deaths of Gazans that are not their responsibility is sadly nothing new. In the early days of the war, you may remember there were reports of an Israeli airstrike on a hospital that killed 500 Gazan civilians. That story turned out to be false. No rocket hit a hospital, it hit a parking lot next to the hospital. It wasn't fired by Israel, but by Islamic Jihad, a terrorist group allied with Hamas, and 500 people weren't killed. The death toll was less than 50. But if you still Google the words Gaza hospital attack, the original false coverage has not been taken down by the mainstream media. And now we have a new blood libel against Israel. This time, Israel's accused of killing dozens and injuring hundreds in a wanton attack on a displaced persons camp. Mainstream media coverage even mistranslated Prime Minister Netanyahu's words to imply that Israel took responsibility for the deaths. Here's the CNN headline quoting Netanyahu, referring to the incident as, quote, a tragic mistake, when in fact he called it in Hebrew a takala tragit. The word takala does not mean mistake, it means mishap. This is important because he wasn't admitting error, as he would be if he called it a mistake. He was simply saying that this incident was tragic and unintended. It should also be noted, as we have said many times before on this show, that Israel has done more than any army in history to protect enemy civilians from harm. This has been noted repeatedly by none other than Major John Spencer, Chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point, the leading expert on the subject. So what actually happened in Rafah on Monday? For that, we turn to our good friend, IDF Reserve Major Elliot Chodoff, to break it all down. Elliot, welcome back once again to Eyes on Israel. Good to have you back.
Thanks, Pesach. Good to be back.
All right, so Elliot, What happened here in Rafah the other day? Could you set the record straight, give us the actual details so that our viewers, our audience, will know the truth?
Sure. First of all, it's a tragedy. Anytime innocents, non-involved, non-combatants get killed is a tragedy. The question is, who's behind the tragedy? Is it a pure, as originally said by Prime Minister Netanyahu, a takala, a mishap, a breakdown of something, or is there something a little more involved in it? So let's start with the fact that this particular event, even more so than the hospital, provided the media with a perfect storm of propaganda. You have the fact that it happened in the environment of Rafah, which means that it can be connected incorrectly to the Israeli ground operation there. One thing have nothing to do with the other. It involved displaced people in a humanitarian zone that was supposed to be a safe zone. Here again, a story in and of itself. American weapons. How many more pieces do you need to put in to create, again, this perfect storm of propaganda? Except, A, the event itself was the targeting of two senior Hamas leaders who are actually responsible for the terrorism out of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. In other words, why these characters were in Gaza is its own question, but the connection between West Bank and Gaza is tremendous. This morning, once again, there was shooting from the West Bank into Israeli villages on this side, as they would say, of the Green Line, not in the so-called territories. So Hamas is Hamas. That's number one. Israel targeted these two guys because they are leading Hamas terrorists. They happen to be in one of the neighborhoods on the outskirts of Rafah. They could have been in Khan Yunis. They could have been in Gaza. They could have been in the West Bank. They could have been anywhere. They happened to be there. In other words, the coincidence of the ground operation and this operation was pure, just happened to be that way. That's number one. Number two, they were targeted with extremely precise small warhead weapons. In other words, the idea, as we generally do, and in this case we were able to do, at least on the surface, was target these two people. They were apparently in a corrugated steel hut. We knew where they were. The missile or missiles hit and took them out.
Hold on. So
Yes.
before you go on, because I saw reports, and I'm sure many other people did, that some massive bombs were used, the kind of bombs the U.S. didn't want Israel to use.
Exactly incorrect. Precision-guided, small warhead weapons, being precisely used for precisely this type of an operation. This is the mission for these weapons. That's what they were used for. And then some 100+ yards away, a fire breaks out among the tents. Incidentally, these two terrorists were not in the humanitarian area. They were outside of it by about 100 yards. In other words, there was absolutely no reason for Israel to assume that there would be any sort of additional damage. I hate the term collateral. Any sort of additional damage beyond the targeting. You know what? A bystander walking by, perhaps, but nothing of any significance or any scale from a military perspective. And then this fire erupts. And according to their reports, and on the one hand, I don't trust them. On the other hand, I have no reason, in this case, not to believe them after the fact. Some 45 people are killed, hundreds are injured, which wouldn't be surprising in a fire that breaks out in a tent city of evacuees. In other words, here, unlike the hospital, I will accept their numbers for lack of a better one, even though I don't trust them. And now the story. Go ahead. I mean, a fire did break out. We know a fire broke out among the tents. That's for real. Okay. So now the question is, where does the fire come from? And the first thing, of course, the blame is Israel dropped these massive bombs into this humanitarian area. Pesach, trust me. If Israel had dropped a couple of 2,000-pound bombs into a tent area, the death toll would have zeros after it, not numbered in the 40s. We'd be talking about hundreds, if not even more than that. So that was clearly false to begin with. But still, the fire broke out. The initial estimate by the IDF, and by the way, it was investigated immediately. And here I have to say, the IDF investigates every operation, success and failure. In other words, the idea that this needs to be checked. Any decent army does a post-op check. What worked, what didn't work, what worked as planned, what didn't work as planned. And here this was certainly not planned. So the first question is, how did it happen? The first speculation early on the next morning was that perhaps a piece of shrapnel had flown the 100 yards, which is not impossible, not likely, but not impossible, hit a propane tank, caused it to explode. This was the best explanation we could come up with on short notice. On deeper study, we find that in the immediate aftermath of our attack, there were secondary explosions. Now, for those who are not familiar, explosives can cause other explosives to explode. And it turns out there was ammunition there. There were bombs and missiles there. There was a rocket launching site adjacent to the humanitarian area. Let's be clear, a Hamas rocket launching site next to the humanitarian area. And these things simply blew up as a result of the Israeli attack and caused the damage that they caused.
So, Elliot, we only have about a minute and a half left, but let me just summarize what we have here. We have the same old story where Hamas uses a densely populated civilian area as a place, first of all, for actual combatants to hide out.
Correct.
Secondly, to store weapons and to use it as a launching pad for attacks on Israeli civilian areas. The whole thing is a legitimate military target, even if Israel had targeted it.
Yes, but let me make one correction here. They didn't store weapons, they stored munitions. Had they stored rifles, nothing would have happened. They stored explosives.
Right.
Big difference.
In other words, it was basically booby-trapped that if Israel were to even to do this small scale operation just to take out a couple of people, it was primed for this explosion to happen. And once again, the civilian casualties, as tragic as they are, the responsibility for them, both legally and morally, rests solely on the shoulders of Hamas.
Yes.
Elliot, we don't have a lot more time. I just want to tell all of our listeners, we're going to have a longer form conversations as we do frequently with Elliot on my podcast, the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast, available on all podcast platforms. Go look for it there. Elliot, thank you once again. Thank you so much for joining Eyes on Israel. We'll have you back soon.
Always a pleasure.
We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel in just a few moments.